Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is a book about winning friends and influencing people. Language that sounds transactional, even manipulative. Yet, it sold over 30 million copies and is still recommended in business schools, leadership programs, and sales floors across the world nearly a century later. Warren Buffett took Carnegie's course at age 20. Soviet leadership had it secretly translated for internal use only, banned from the general public until perestroika. It's a strange kind of endorsement, wouldn't you think? Even people building very different systems wanted these tools for themselves while keeping them from everyone else. Why would they do this if this was a book not about manipulating people and purely about winning friends and making relationships and friendships that help you succeed? Is this book a manual for genuine human connection or a manual for getting what you want from people while appearing genuine? I think that tension is the spine for this whole conversation, and I'm going to try to condense these basically 70 odd pages of notes that I have on this book and these thoughts between what this book is actually about and what people think it's about, right? Can you actually win a friend? Or does the language of the title already tell you something about how Carnegie and maybe the culture he was writing for thought about relationships? What is winning a friend? What does that mean? What does it mean to win a friend, to win something? Well, it means to be successful. It means to gain something for your own benefit. So maybe that tells you a little bit something about the way he thought about people and the way he thought about using the relationships he had with people for his own benefit or to help him in his career. So let's start off by getting to the bottom of the way this man thought, by getting to the bottom of who this man was. So who was Dale Carnegie? Dale Carnegie, in 1988, was born on a poor farm in Maryville, Missouri. His family was so poor that he was the second son of farmers, and he had to wake before dawn, by some accounts 3 a.m., by others 4 a.m., to feed the pigs and milk the cows before walking to school. He wasn't particularly athletically gifted, and other students shunned him because his clothes were shabby and ill-fitting. This matters because this man who would eventually teach millions of people how to be liked started out as a kid nobody wanted to be around, right? Then after watching a Chautauqua speaker perform in Warrensburg, young Carnegie copied the man's speaking style and mannerisms, and it worked. He went from being shunned to becoming a popular student who taught his own classmates public speaking, which is worth sitting on because his first breakthrough in life came not from working harder on the farm, but from actually learning to perform confidence and connection. That's basically the entire thesis of his later career, discovered by accident as a teenager, right? Carnegie actually almost didn't graduate college. He failed Latin and left Missouri State Normal School in 1908 without finishing his bachelor's degree. He tried sales as well, and according to some biographers, his heart was never really in it, and he was less than successful despite his evident gift for self-expression. He chased a dream of being an actor in New York, enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and landed one real touring role, and found later success and reportedly hated the experience, deciding quickly that a life in theater wasn't for him. He was broke, living at a YMCA, and by some accounts in squalor and unable to make ends meet. Yet, he still walked away from a stable Packard sales job to teach public speaking instead, a course nobody had asked him to create. He pitched his YMCA manager on letting him teach a public speaking class in exchange for 80% of the proceeds. In his very first session, he ran out of material and improvised by asking students to talk about something that made them angry. And amazingly, it worked. That single improvisation became the foundation of the Dale Carnegie course. And then by 1914, he was earning about $500 a week, which today is roughly $16,100 in today's money, which is amazing money to earn per week, right? And by 1916, he sold out a lecture at Carnegie Hall. The name change is a detail worth lingering on because he changed the spelling from Carnegey to Carnegie, which is widely seen as a deliberate move to associate himself with steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in the world. The man who taught the world about sincerity rebranded himself using the world's most famous surname, literally for personal gain, which I think we shouldn't take as necessarily hypocrisy, but it is a detail that complicates the pure sincerity that we see when reading into his philosophy. So he got rich, then lost everything in 1929 because of the stock market crash. Then he had to rebuild. An experience which he later said taught him to accept the worst that could happen and then improve from there, which is, I think, a admirable philosophy that we can take on into our own lives, because we do fail often. In 1936, Simon & Schuster publishes How to Win Friends and Influence People. It launched with a modest initial print run of just 5,000 copies and became a runaway bestseller, eventually selling nearly 5 million copies in his lifetime alone, translated into every major language. After this breakdown of Carnegie's background, I've got a few questions that I've been pondering on, actually, particularly first about Carnegie's core breakthrough. So, Carnegie copied a confident speaker style as a teenager, which actually reminds me of the philosophy of faking it till you make it. So, is faking it till you make it the same thing as what he later taught, or is it different? I think there's a lot of nuance into it. I think Carnegie demonstrates in this stage of his life that learning what makes other people successful is a strategic move that's going to help you be successful. Because when you try to emulate the strengths of successful people, there's no reason why you can't translate it into your own success. And secondly, him changing his name to sort of piggyback on a famous rich man's reputation right before writing a book about sincerity and not manipulating people. Does that undercut his message? Or is it just smart marketing? Almost everything Carnegie tried before this, sales, acting, finishing college, he failed at or walked away from. So how much of his philosophy do you think was reverse engineered from his own rejection rather than handed down from some innate gift or charm? I'd love to hear people's thoughts in the comments. Now I'd like to talk about the world he was writing into. Basically the context of the world Dale Carnegie existed in. So in 1936, the world was in the heart of the Great Depression. People weren't looking for charm tips. They were looking for any edge that might help them keep a job, lend a sale, or stay employable when millions were out of work. Context matters. This book is as much a survival manual for an anxious economy as it is a self-help text. And also, this world, we must flag, is also pre-television and pre-internet. So interpersonal skill was really almost the only tool available for advancement. No LinkedIn, no portfolio website, no Zoom call. If you wanted to get ahead, you did it across a desk, in a room, face to face. I think that changes how directly transferable some of his advice is to 2026, where so much influence nowadays happens through text, messages, algorithmic visibility rather than sort of face-to-face charm. And I think it leads to the question of, if I were to write this book today, what would I change? Is winning friends and influencing people even the same skill when most influence building now happens over text, DMs, and content, and no real face-to-face conversation? Are people really winning friends today? Or is influence the name of the game? Let's talk about the core philosophy of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People before the principles. So if we strip away Dale Carnegie's 30 principles, there is really one idea that we see underneath all of them. Like, you can change other people's behavior simply by changing your own. That is the core belief, core principle, core philosophy. Everything else is really just a tactic in service of that one belief. And Carnegie is explicit that this only works if it's sincere. He insists that principles will only work when they come from the heart. He says he isn't advocating for a bag of tricks, but a new way of living, a new way of life. This is a line every critique of the book either accepts at face value or treats with deep suspicion, which is worth flagging because it is a genuine fault in the line and how people have interpreted the book for a long time. Because it is weird that he says he isn't advocating for a bag of tricks when the whole book essentially gives you tricks and the way to use them in order to win friends, make people trust you, make people like you by complimenting them, being a good listener because people love good listeners. It sort of reads as faking it, not being genuine. The most quoted distillation of the whole philosophy, the one idea Carnegie says matters most if you remember nothing else, is make a habit of looking at every interaction from the other person's perspective. Not just understanding their opinion, but to understand why they hold it in the first place. So basically putting yourself in another person's shoes, being empathetic. And in a moment of conflict, or situations of conflict, fully trying to understand and listen to the reason the other person believes what they believe in, why they do, and where they're validated and where they're invalidated. Carnegie says these techniques only work if they're sincere. But can a technique designed to produce a specific outcome in another person ever really be sincere? Or does intent baked into the method itself complicate his claim? When you're doing something because you're trying to elicit a reaction in another person, that doesn't come off as genuine or sincere because there's a specific intent as to why you're doing what you're doing. For example, kindness, showing a kind gesture, giving a gift. If you give a gift to someone because you want something from them, did you really sincerely want to give them a gift because you appreciate them or love them or care about them? Or were you giving them a gift because you wanted them to feel validated and essentially like you more, or subconsciously owe you something, or see you from a different light, or see you as a generous person? The intent behind that gift giving in and of itself complicates the claim of sincerity. I want you to think of someone who has genuinely influenced you. A mentor, a parent, a boss. Did they do it by using a technique? Or do you think by actually caring? Could you even tell the difference from the outside? So let's talk about the fundamental techniques Dale Carnegie talks about in handling people. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. He says criticism puts people on the defensive and makes them justify themselves rather than change. Psychologically, rewarding good behavior works far better than punishing bad behavior if your goal is actually to shift someone's actions. Think about performance reviews, parenting, even discourse online. How often does direct criticism actually change minds versus just entrenching people further into their positions or their opinions? Because human beings want to be right. They want to defend themselves. They want to look right. They want to be perceived as right. So they are not going to go back on their word and be perceived as wrong. Second principle is give honest and sincere appreciation. The need to feel appreciated is one of the most basic human needs there is. Carnegie says everyone wants to feel good about the effort they put in, whether anyone's watching or not. In the modern world, we're going to look at founders who build teams that stay loyal during hard times are very often the ones who made appreciation a habit, arousing the other person an eager want. This is the principle at the heart of all persuasion. The world is full of self-seeking people trying to get what they want. So the rare person who genuinely tries to understand and serve what someone else wants has very little competition. Most salespeople spend their whole career selling without ever truly seeing things from the customer's perspective and wonder why they aren't successful, while ignoring the customer's actual needs their entire time. So I want you to think about someone who criticized you directly. Do you think it changed your behavior? Did it just make you defend yourself? Even if you privately agreed they had a point. Carnegie says appreciation has to be sincere to work. But if you practice sincerity as a discipline, forcing yourself to notice good things about people, does it stop being sincere, or does sincerity become a skill like any other? Whether you're applying for a role, pitching ideas, or even convincing a friend to do something, have you been selling what you want instead of starting with what they want? So Carnegie talks about 6 ways to make people like you. First one is becoming genuinely interested in other people. Carnegie's own test of this is he'd help a stranger with no expectation of return, and people would ask him what he was really trying to get out of it. His answer was that anyone too selfish to share a little happiness without expecting something back has a soul no bigger than a sour crab apple. And his most famous one-line on this: you'll make more friends in 2 months by being genuinely interested in other people than in 2 years trying to make other people interested in you. Secondly, Carnegie tells people to remember names. Carnegie collected detailed stories of both famous and unknown people who gained enormously personally and professionally simply through their ability to recall names. The deeper point: when people say I'm bad with names, what they usually mean is they never built a system for remembering them. The same way people will say I don't have time usually mean they never built a system for prioritizing it. Another principle is being a good listener. Listening intently without interrupting signals to someone that you find them important and worth your time. And it's a skill, it's an innate trait, one that needs to be built, and one that takes deliberate practice to develop. Talking in terms of the other person's interests. The people who do this well research the other person's actual interests before the conversation and open with that, not with the thing they're trying to sell. Make the other person feel important, sincerely. This is, again, the appreciation principle wearing a different hat. But the emphasis on sincerely recurs constantly because Carnegie clearly anticipated this would be the section most easily turned into manipulation. In your daily life, I want you to think about whether you can remember the name of the last 5 people you met. If not, what does that say about how important you made them feel, regardless of your intentions? There is a dichotomy between curiosity about someone and strategic curiosity designed to make them like you. Have you ever been on the receiving end of someone's fake interest? How do you know it was fake? Was it something they said or something underneath what they said? What could it cost you this week to ask one more follow-up question than you normally would in a conversation and actually wait for the answer? The first principle Carnegie talks about is the only way to win an argument is to avoid it. He says arguments tend to produce animosity and resistance rather than agreement. Carnegie's advice is to look for common ground and mutual understanding instead of trying to win. Never say you're wrong is the second principle. Even when someone is factually incorrect, bluntly telling them so tends to trigger defensiveness and shuts down the very conversation you're trying to have. The third principle is, if you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. Owning your own mistakes fast demonstrates honesty and integrity, easing tension and building trust rather than eroding it. Carnegie says begin in a friendly way. Regardless of how justified you feel, the goal of a conversation should never be to simply prove a point. Friendly, neutral framing produces far more productive outcomes than coming in hot. Let the other person feel the idea is their own. People have far more faith in ideas they discover for themselves than in ideas handed to them. So instead of forcing your opinion on someone, make suggestions and let them arrive at the conclusion themselves. Another principle Carnegie talks about is try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view and find their why. Other people may be completely wrong, but they don't believe they are. Don't condemn them. There's always a reason someone thinks or acts the way they do, and finding that reason gives you the real key to their actions and possibly their whole personality. Another principle Carnegie talks about is appealing to nobler motives. Framing a request around someone's higher principles and ideals tends to be far more motivating than framing it around obligation or fear. This whole section maps almost perfectly onto negotiation theory. Getting to yes without anyone feeling like they lost. It also strikes close to how good debate coaches train students to argue. As a debater myself, we are taught not to crush the opposing view, but to understand it well enough to reframe it. So, intently listening and arguing well. As well as concepts of taking your opponent's argument at its best. Looking at it as an entrepreneur, this section is particularly gold for fundraising conversations, or negotiating with co-founders and handling disagreements with family or community leaders who may have very different general assumptions about how businesses should be done. The principle of finding someone's why before trying to change their mind applies directly to navigating intergenerational or cross-cultural disagreement and not just sales. I think we should think about arguments, which is an area that strikes particular interest in me. And thinking about the last argument I actually won. Do I think I changed the other person's mind? No, I don't think I did that particularly. But I think what I did was actually talk it out with them. And I think our disagreements were still inherently there in that conversation. More agreeing to disagree than, coming to common ground. And Carnegie also says people have more faith in ideas that discover themselves. Which is true. People are more rooted into their own opinions that they've come to than in trying to be indoctrinated with an idea. However, they are societal, stereotypical ideas that have been ingrained into culture, ingrained now into the way people think, because that's what they've grown up on. They've been raised to think that way. They've been raised to have those ideas. When us as human beings try to prove ourselves as being right, and instead of trying to find out why other people think what they think, it tends to cause a lot of conflict. It tends to cause a lot of misunderstandings in all levels of life. It could be simply you and your friend, or it could be at the very highest levels, political leaders who have the power to, change landscapes, powers of destruction, so much powers in their hands. And these high-level disagreements that influence millions tend to be because of not being ethical and empathetic leaders. Dale Carnegie also tells us how to be leaders and what a leader's job is. He says leaders need to begin with praise and honest appreciation before offering criticism or advice. He says softening the blow while keeping the environment constructive rather than punitive helps. He says leaders need to call attention to people's mistakes indirectly rather than head on, since direct call-outs tend to embarrass rather than correct. He says we need to talk about our own mistakes before criticizing someone else's, because sharing your own failures humanizes you and makes the other person far more receptive to feedback. He says, as a leader, we need to ask questions instead of giving direct orders. He frames this as a more effective way to lead people toward the right answer than simply commanding them to it. The steel magnate Charles Schwab built a reputation for praising employees publicly for their efforts, and it boosted productivity far more than fault-finding ever did. A construction supervisor named George B. Johnston faced pushback from workers refusing to wear hard hats. Instead of disciplining them, he asked why they were uncomfortable and adjusted based on their feedback and got full compliance without any resentment. This is essentially the section about servant leadership before that term really existed. For founders or leaders building teams, especially at early stages, where people are choosing whether to stay and looking for reasons to stay beyond salary, I think this session is the most operationally useful one in the whole book. The Schwab and hard hat examples both share a pattern. A leadership that listens before it corrects gets compliance without resentment, which is a much more durable outcome than compliance through authority, right? People like to come to their own ideas. People like to find their own reasons to stay motivated. And Carnegie tells us to understand this, to understand what makes people motivated, and sort of lead them to finding that motivation on their own. All right, now I think we need to talk about the criticism and where the book gets uncomfortable. The most common critique that I have personally for the book, and I think it's one worth voicing directly rather than dodging. It is a question, simply a fundamental question. Are Carnegie's principles, or are they manipulation tactics with better PR? What do I mean by this? Carnegie's own insistence that they must come from the heart is either the answer to this critique or a slightly convenient deflection of it. Because it does strike you as manipulation when you read into it. It makes you ponder more about whether what you're building with other people is genuine, or you're trying to get people to simply like you because you've seen something you can gain from them. Some readers and other critics have pointed out the book underweights power dynamics. It largely assumes a level playing field between two people negotiating in good faith, and says comparatively little about status, leverage, or what happens when one party simply has more power than the other and doesn't need to be liked. Sometimes you're going to face individuals that are high and mighty, have a lot of authority, in positions of power, that don't need your validation, don't need to be liked to get what they want from other people. It's the dichotomy between power and relationships, and what actually is the most effective method of getting what you want from other people. I think Carnegie tries, by all means, to look at this sort of from a morally good lens, and so trying to be an empathetic leader in order to get what you want, instead of being a leader that forcefully gets what he wants from other people. And it's also worth noting that the book it is a byproduct of its time and the culture. His examples lean heavily on a particularly mid-century American business and social context. So translating some of these techniques into the modern world and cross-culturally into different norms and traditions and hierarchies and conflicts is worth exploring before taking everything you've read word for word and bar for bar into your daily life. Because there are many different landscapes that would react differently to someone suddenly employing some of Carnegie's techniques. To synthesize it all, nearly every principle in this book, stripped off its 1930s language, reduces to one move. Shift the frame from yourself to the other person. Do not criticize. Think about how they'll receive it. Remember their names. Think about what matters to them. Avoid arguments. Think about what they actually need to walk away with. I think this book will make you more effective at getting what you want from people, yes. And whether that makes you a better person depends entirely on what you want and why. The book itself can't answer that question for you. Carnegie's repeated insistence that it has come from the heart gestures at it. Which leads back to my opening question. Was this a manual for connection or a manual for influence? And probably the honest answer is that Carnegie never really believed those two were different things. He believes connection is influence and influence is connection, and that there is no real difference between those two. And depending on who you are, it is either the most optimistic or the most cynical reading of human relationships. If everyone around you genuinely, sincerely, deliberately practiced at Carnegie wants us to do, every principle in this book, would the world be a warmer place? Or would it be a world where everyone is quietly trying to influence everyone else all the time and nobody admits it? Carnegie believed that you changed others before changing yourself first. Do you actually believe that? Or do you think some people only change when something forces them to change? Try out some of these principles in the next week or next couple of days and try reporting back in the comments, letting us know how it worked, if it worked, whether you got what you wanted from the other person, whatever it was, whether it's helping you build more genuine relationships with people and thereby increasing your influence. To sort of tease what we're going to be talking about in a later episode, there's a Japanese book called Ikigai, and explicitly these two books almost argue with each other. Carnegie says influence people, get ahead, win. Ikigai asks what's even worth getting ahead for, right? And that is a key dichotomy that we're so fascinated to talk about and discover in the next week. All right. That was how to win friends and influence people. Let us know whether you take this on into your own life.